Today we're talking about the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and maybe just a few words about ourselves. My name is Elisabeth Ignaszak. If you change to the next slide, Ursula. I'm a freelance consultant. I work on topics like climate, so everything from doing carbon accounting all the way to SBTi. I also work on sustainability reporting, so I was very deeply involved in the CSRD and the VSME and also EU taxonomy. And then finally, I also help businesses with sustainability management. So for example, setting up management systems like the environmental management systems along the ISO 14001. Yeah, and with that, I pass on to you, Ursula.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I am Ursula Navarro. I am a consultant in sustainability, and I also support companies with different topics going from carbon footprint, life cycle assessments. We also do climate risk assessments, and I am also doing a PhD in environmental toxicology.
Perfect. So what do we have on the agenda for today? We have a short meeting, so this will be a quick run through various topics. We will talk about key concepts, then what is the Science-Based Targets Initiative. We will talk about the advantages of committing to SBTi, as well as the risks and challenges. And then just what does the general process look like if you want to commit to the SBTi targets, and then how we can help. And at the end, we have some time for questions. And as I said, if you do have questions, feel free to already put them in the chat now. Yeah, and with that, on to you, Ursula, for the key concepts.
Okay, so before starting, we would like to give you like an overview of the most important that we consider the key concepts that we should understand. So for instance, this whole process relies heavily on the calculations of your carbon emissions and covering scope 1, 2, and 3. Very shortly, scope 1 includes direct emissions from own or controlled sources like fuel combustion in company vehicles or any type of sources that can be consumed at your facility, whereas scope 2 would cover indirect emissions, but from the generation of energy sources. So if you purchase electricity or heating or cooling consumed by your company. And lastly, scope 3 will encompass all other indirect emissions that occur in a company's value chain, and this also covers upstream and downstream your production levels. So also for the this whole process, we need to understand when we're talking about the target boundaries, and in this case, the SBTi boundaries define type of emissions that will include its kind of near and also long-term targets. So you should be consistent with how your company inventory was defined. And in this case, the targets must cover at least 95% of the scope 1 and 2, and also 90% of scope 3 if it's applicable. But we will also discuss about this process in specific terms later on. So also when it comes to the base year, this is like the starting point of for emission reductions, and it refers to the starting points for when you commit to these reductions. And also for the near term and net zero targets, they must have, so when it comes to the near term targets, they must have a target year within 5 to 8 or 10 years from the date the target is submitted to the SBTi for its validation. And then when we're talking about the net zero targets, these are more long-term commitments. So these have to have very clear plans for decarbonization and neutralizing your residual emissions, but in the long term. And lastly, when we're talking about this sectoral decarbonization approach, these are very sector-specific pathways and follow very specific methodologies that could be, for instance, for transportation, for energy, or for construction sectors. Because these specific type of sectors are very, their profiles of carbon emissions are very unique. And that's why we need a specific decarbonization measurements or targets or initiatives.
Yeah, so what is the Science-Based Targets Initiative? It's basically a organization that wants to help businesses to set targets, so climate reduction targets that are in line with science. What does that mean? They want to be in line with the Paris Climate Agreement, meaning to reduce global warming to well below 2 degrees, if possible 1.5 degrees. And they are founded in collaboration with a number of organizations that you might know, for example, the WWF or the World Resources Institute. So they have a reasonably robust methodology, and they provide a lot of guidance and tools in order to help businesses to set these targets in line with science. And back to you, Ursula.
Yeah, so now very quickly on why should we commit to the SBTi. So some advantages for you. For instance, the first one would be because of brand reputations. So we all know that sustainability is really becoming a very key for consumers, and we are also becoming increasingly aware of the effects that our choices might have on the environment. So this is kind of growing as a hot topic, and that's why brand reputation for sustainability seems to be very important. For investor confidence as well, because it's not only us as consumers that we are heavily looking at sustainability as a key indicator of business credibility, but also investors are increasingly taking interests in business environmental policies or profiles. When it comes to resilience against future or short-term regulations, also we know that national governments continue to work to implement, for instance, the Paris Agreement in the whole EU. So companies can expect to see more regulation to decrease emission-intensive activities. And in that regard, the SBTi process can help you to face these overcome or like these future kind of regulations that we need to have in mind. When it comes to increased regulations as well, with the transition to a low carbon economy, companies that are aligning their strategies with this step change are opening themselves up to let's say like a world of opportunity. So for instance, there's a very interesting case of a company for instance Sony, that they implemented a kind of project called Theresa, and their science-based target helped on the development of new products for use in their manufacturing process. And also they implemented this like new plastic thingy called Surplus that was made up of kind of 99% of recycled material, and this helped them to reduce CO2 emissions by nearly 80% during manufacture, and that also comes with a reduction in costs. And that has to do with the fifth, so bottom line savings. Also, a lot of companies are already can see cost reductions due to these efficiency improvements, and this can help them to optimize operations and reduce dependency on really heavily emission sources like fossil fuel based. And lastly, competitive edge, because with increased innovation or like by strengthening investor confidence and also clients' confidence, we can see that companies that are aligning to the SBTi can also succeed in a low carbon economy.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not all roses with the SBTi. I'm not sure how many of you tried to look at the SBTi standard. It is quite complex, so it does come with a few risks and challenges to commit to SBTi, some of which we have listed here. So first of all, let's say you want to commit. Of course, you need to measure your carbon footprint with a certain precision. And in particular with scope 3, that can be a challenge, especially for larger corporations where the value chains are quite complex. So this is something to keep in mind. Then you might also need to when you go on the path of decarbonization, that will definitely cost money, because most businesses, the simple things they have already done, and now we're moving on to the more difficult parts. And those difficult sometimes means that it's complicated in terms of technology, but difficult can also mean that it is expensive. And then you have things like misalignment internally. So not everyone might be on board with being on this trajectory. So you have to do a lot of stakeholder engagement really to bring everyone on board. And maybe the two largest risks are the ones you see here on the right. So if you commit publicly to the Science Based Targets Initiative, you will be held accountable. And that means if you do not meet your targets, that can be a big risk for your reputation, right? So it's great to say we're committed if you can fulfill it. That is a really big boost, as Ursula explained. However, if you cannot keep up with those very ambitious targets, then that can be quite critical. And just to give you an example, I was recently talking to a company that is producing cheese. And obviously for them, decarbonizing cows is going to be a tough challenge, right? So because the Science Based Target Initiative wants you to decarbonize quite a lot, and not every business will be able to meet these very strict criteria. And finally, there's always a risk that the SBTi currently is actually being redone. The standard is being updated. And of course, it might be that you're also affected by these updates, that things change just within the SBTi criteria as the science moves along. So these are just some things to keep in mind, that it sounds great, but you really have to think about whether this is the best path for you. And what I see with many businesses is that they follow the idea of SBTi. So because most people agree that it's good to follow science in terms of carbon emissions. However, they may not go through the official process of SBTi, just rather follow the idea, which gives them more flexibility. Having said that, I've also seen customers who just have to do it because otherwise they will lose clients. So you might not always have the option to not do it. Okay, this enough of advantages and disadvantages. Now let's look into what the process actually looks like.
So for the process itself, we can summarize it in 5 big steps. The first one, of course, as it's also already mentioned, the commitment that you have to do. So you have to submit this commitment through a letter to the SBTi. And then you will have to state your intention to set science-based targets. Once you are kind of committed, then you are recognized on the SBTi website as committed, and then you have up until 24 months to submit the targets for validation. So the development of targets on step 2, that means that your company has to develop these targets based on the guidelines that they provide, and they also Among the different kind of steps that they suggest, you have to include calculating your emissions, of course, across all these scopes I already mentioned before. And these targets must cover at least 95% of scope 1 and 2. And for near-term targets, at least 67% of scope 3, if these emissions represent more than 40% of the total emissions. For the third steps is kind of submit the targets for validation. So after you develop the targets, then your company has to submit them to the SBTi. And this includes also paying like a processing fee and providing detailed and very well documented, of course, calculations of your emissions. And then the SBTi will review the submissions, and they'll also kind of provide some feedback within a specific periods of time. That could be, for instance, 30 days up until 60 days, which will depend on the target type. So 30 days for near-term targets and 60 days for net zero targets. And the fourth step, it includes the communication. So once once is like the approval of the targets, the companies then will be added to the SBTi approved target list, and then you will receive guidance on how to communicate your targets to all of the stakeholders that you have identified, which are special for or let's say important for your company. And finally, for the disclose process, the companies must disclose their emissions annually, and you will have to track the progress toward the targets that you committed. And this can be done, for instance, through sustainability reports or other type of official communications as well.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about targets. What does it actually mean to set up targets? So first of all, you need to decide what target type. So what are these? One is absolute targets. So we're talking about carbon, tons of carbon emissions. So this is what you usually have as a result of your, if you do carbon accounting, your CCF. This will give you absolute values of emissions, and you can also use absolute values for your targets. In contrast to intensity-based targets, what that means is that you put the emissions in relation to a different number. So that could be a financial number, so your turnover, or it could be relative to a certain product. So these are intensity-based targets, which you can use in certain industries. Then you need to determine what scopes and emissions you cover. As Ursula already mentioned, you have to include a minimum amount of your emissions. Of course, you can always do more. So the minimum requirements are that for the near-term targets, you need to have at least 2/3 of scope 3 emissions, and for the long-term targets, about a bit more than 90%. And finally, what does near-term and long-term target even mean? So near-term targets means that they're reasonably close, 5 to 15 years from the base year, so that first year that counts. And the long-term target usually is between 2040 and 2050. It has to be before 2050 or 2050 for it to be in line with the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And of course, this is the whole point why it's called science-based. It needs to be aligned with science, meaning limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees or at least 2 degrees. Yeah, and that brings us to the end of our presentation. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the standard is quite complex. So if you do need help with setting your targets, we can do this in different ways. Of course, we can help in the first step, even doing your carbon accounting for you. And in particular, scope 3 is often a challenge in more complex organizations. And then also the SBTi process itself, that this is something we can support you with. And of course, the whole point of doing this is to actually reduce your emissions. So doing emissions reductions, planning and strategy, that is also something we can help you with. Yeah, and with that, we have a few minutes left for questions. Feel free to type them in the chat if you have any.